Hi there, my name is Naiomi Metallic. I'm a Mi'kmaq lawyer and a law professor, and I'm making this video on Janet's request to talk a little bit about the use of legislation with respect to Indigenous people. I have experience with this and have written about this in some of my academic work, so wanted to share a little bit of my thinking on this with you. So, the way I see legislation is as a tool, and tools can be used to do good, or they can be used to do bad. And really, it just depends on what's in it. Legislation can be bad if it's exploitative, if it limits Indigenous rights, if it takes away land, if it controls Indigenous peoples. And we have seen that in Canada really for a long time. That was the only example of legislation, federal legislation with respect to Indigenous people or First Nations in particular. And by that I'm talking about the Indian Act. But legislation can also be used for good. And on another slide, I'll talk about what are the types of things that can be in legislation that make it positive. But I will say that in the United States, where the law is, I would say, more advanced in terms of recognition of the inherent right of self-government, there was legal cases, actually back in the 1800s, that recognized that Native tribes in the U.S. Possessed inherent sovereignty, and the law has developed in such a way to really recognize that more, in some periods more than others, but certainly since about the 70s, there's been a lot of recognition. And along with the recognition in the courts of an inherent right, there's also been legislative activity, so laws passed by the U.S. Congress, and a lot of them, in fact. And one of the little projects we're going to help, I'm going to supervise a law student to do for Janet to inform this work is to look at the U.S. legislation. They actually have a statute on health rights in the U.S., and they also have a statute on child welfare, and I'll talk about Bill C-92, the Canadian sort of similar act, although in the U.S. they've had that act since the 1970s. And these acts don't try to control Indigenous peoples per se, but rather try to help facilitate and implement the inherent right to self-government. Those are some examples of how legislation can be used to promote the rights of Indigenous people. And I do believe that since the coming into force of Bill C-15 a couple weeks ago, which is about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it requires Canada to implement and create a plan in order to implement the UN Declaration, and that's going to require Canada to change its law, and it's going to require Canada to pass new laws and do other activities. But this takes me to my next point, is that in order to understand the role that legislation can play, it's good to understand how Western governments tend to work. In government, I mean the Canadian Parliament. I also mean, provincial governments as well. So, there can be certainly different types of governance and governments, but generally the ways we would say Western governments operate is that they have three different levels of government. They have the Parliament, which in Canada, the federal one is made up of both the Senate and the House of Commons. And their primary function of the lawmakers that we elect every 4 or 5 years is to pass law. And sometimes I think we lose sight of this in the Indigenous context because we haven't really had a culture of the federal government passing law in order to advance Indigenous people's rights and interests. Often it's been more the opposite, right? To exploit or take away Indigenous lands. So one can understand the fear or apprehension people might have about legislation, but normally governments do pass laws, and it's definitely an important function of their role. And I'll talk about it a bit more, but when government puts something in law, it's actually sometimes easier to enforce a commitment or an obligation in law than it is using the other instruments that I'm going to cover in a second. So parliaments do laws, but then we have what's called the executive. And the executive is the people who work under the government, right? So for our purposes, this would include Indigenous Services Canada and all their employees. They're all part of the executive. And also, cabinet ministers, like the Minister of Indian Affairs, even though he's also a member of Parliament, we kind of have this overlap where he's also a member of the executive. And they don't pass laws. Instead, the executive can do things like negotiate agreements and sign agreements. And we've seen this fairly often in the Indigenous context. And they can also do things like pass policies. So these are not to the level of laws, but they might pass policies about how they're supposed to carry out their work. And this is something that has actually been used a lot in the First Nations context. And I have argued in some of my cases and in my research that, in fact, it's relied on too much by the government. But I'll come to that in a sec to explain it more. And then there's the judiciary, right, which are judges in the courts who uphold the Canadian Constitution and interpret law. And they can make law in a way, but they do it on a case-by-case basis. So they can't set out, larger legislation or policies that set out sort of things in a broad way. They can only decide things on sort of a case-by-case basis. So it's important to see how laws get made or laws or policies get made at different levels to understand that there's sometimes limitations as a result of who's making that law. Okay, now that we understand that, let's unpack the different options that exist in terms of looking at First Nations or Indigenous health reform. So let's first talk about the status quo, which is ISK policy and delegation. And so the way that things operate, not just with respect to health, but also with respect to social assistance and child welfare for the last 70 years until very recently with Bill C-92, which I'll mention a bit more about later, has been not to legislate in the areas of essential services. We could also add education, policing, emergency services to this list. So often people think that the Indian Act is like this super comprehensive piece of legislation that, touches on First Nations from cradle to grave. You've probably heard that. Well, that's because there's actually sections in the Indian Act that are about wills and estates, and it controls land and status. But there are significant gaps in the Indian Act. And in fact, aside from some changes brought on by court challenges to the status rules, the actual structure of the Indian Act hasn't changed since 1951. And some really important things that aren't in there are like who provides social assistance, who addresses child welfare, education, policing, emergency services, etc., and health. There's very little on those subjects, and there's a long history of the federal government trying to get the provincial governments to pay for and provide these services, and the provincial government saying, no, First Nations are your responsibility. So all of these areas tend to be plagued by problems of, I call it the hot potato problem, both levels of government trying to deny that they have responsibility in the area. So what ended up happening because of these debates, but then paired with the fact that First Nations people have significant needs in this area, was that eventually the federal government recognized that it had obligations in these areas. But instead of passing new legislation or amending the Indian Act, instead it offered services like FNIB and other health services on reserve, as well as things like social assistance, it through things like policies, and Treasury Board authorities that gave the government the authority to fund these areas. And then eventually, after First Nations call for more control, the government introduced funding agreements where funds were transferred to bands to be able to pay band employees to offer services. And that's known as delegation. And this model, as you all know, has a lot of problems with it. There's been longstanding complaints about underfunding and underserviced provision of services by the federal government. First Nations are not getting anything near what people in the provinces are getting in terms of health or social assistance or child welfare or education, for example. And also that the delegation down from the feds is not self-government, and it's also extremely restrictive and will include things like, that the government calls the shots, all the program terms. There is no decision making here from the First Nations, that there's extensive reporting requirements, that First Nations are extremely constrained in the services they're able to provide. So this is why we know that this is the status quo, and it's been criticized roundly by many people more and more. So I think there is a general view that this is not sustainable, this must change, and so there needs to be reform. And that's not just now. This view has been around for a while in First Nations country. So other options that have developed alongside this are negotiations. So out here, you will have probably heard about the agreement in British Columbia between the federal government and the provincial government and First Nations there about some more expansive form of delegation or taking over of services that is freer and gives more control to the First Nations. And I think that some other groups are looking at this as well. So that can happen over a period of time through negotiations. There would be agreements signed. So that is an option. Sometimes the downside of negotiations is that these can take a long time to negotiate. If the government changes, the new government might not have the same willingness to enter an agreement. These types of agreements benefit the communities that negotiate them. They're not benefiting all First Nations as a whole, whereas we know that, these are sort of problems that affect Indigenous people across the country. And sometimes there can also be challenges around implementation, government funding what they said they were going to fund, and these sorts of things. Another option is litigation, going to court, finding that government is underfunding. Maybe you bring a human rights complaint, or perhaps an Indigenous group wants to argue that they should have a right to self-government over health that's recognized under Section 35. So those are options as well, going to court. This option can also be fairly long and expensive. Going to court is not cheap. It can run sometimes in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. It's also piecemeal too, just like negotiations. It tends to benefit primarily the group that brought the claim. Sometimes it can have broader ripple effects beyond the group that brought the claim, but not always. And even sometimes when you are successful at negotiating, it doesn't mean, or litigating, Indigenous groups may still find themselves back at a negotiation table, because courts only decide what they need to decide. They don't try to set out all of what should be covered. They only decide the narrowest question that they can in front of them in order to resolve the dispute, and then they usually say, we're going to leave it to the parties to fill out the rest through negotiations. Right, so that's one downside to litigation. Then there's another option, which is just do it. First Nations who may feel that they have an inherent right to self-government may say, we're just going to do it. We don't need a federal government or provincial government's blessing in order to do anything. We don't need their participation. We're just going to go ahead and do this. And there have been groups that have done this with some success. At the same time, though, there are some groups who have done this and then have faced repercussions. For example, if the government doesn't agree that they should be exercising this jurisdiction, they may take them to court, they may fine them or something like that. And another downside of the just doing it is that if you go out on your own, then you may not necessarily have funding or support for whatever it is that you want to do. So that can be a real challenge as well. The thing about options like negotiations or legislation is that the expectation is by having the governments participate, they will come to the table recognizing that they have a role to play and an obligation to play in funding, which is so key. So those are the options. And the other one now being legislation, and let's turn to that a little bit more. So let's first of all just talk about the overarching pros and cons of legislation. So legislation, unlike litigation or negotiation, does try to provide, if it's national in scope, like Bill C-92 on child welfare is, it tries to provide a framework that will apply to all Indigenous people across Canada. All right, so it's not just one individual group going for a right or recognition. This still can be a somewhat lengthy process, but probably faster than negotiation. Negotiation can take years, sometimes over a decade. Same with litigation. Litigation can take a long time as well. So in some respects, this can be sometimes a faster route to an outcome. And one thing that I really think is important is that legislation is enforceable in the courts if there is foot dragging by the government, which unfortunately we see more often than we should. And especially, and this is some of my experience, I've seen foot dragging by the government when it comes to implementing their policies, and it's really hard to take them to court when you're arguing that they have, failed to follow their policy. A government will, or a court will say, well, policy is not exactly law. And so they don't feel that they have as much power to really intervene in many cases. And so they tend to be, saying, oh, we can't really get involved in that. So, but when you have something that is set in legislation, you can point to it and say, no, see, it's the law. The government has to follow this. So that is something that I find very good. And one of the reasons why I favor legislative approaches, because it gives us something to really hold the government more accountable to. And there's been a real lack of accountability in the past. Here's some of the cons. Even with legislation that we might say is co-developed, ultimately you're relying on a process that goes through the Canadian Parliament, and so really there might be amendments or Senate might be involved, and that might lead to changes to the legislation. So really the Canadian Parliament has the final say. Although, if you feel that the co-development process works well, that might, address that to some extent. But the thing about legislation, pretty much like anything else, nothing is ever perfect. I have written that there are good things about Bill C-92, but there are also some problems with it, and I'll address that in a bit more in a second. But because of the process, of the lawmaking process, there might be changes that, are not satisfactory, and people might think, well, it's not good enough, right? And so there can be challenges with this, and I think that, when it comes to the status quo is horrible, and changes that we see are good, even including with like C-92 and child welfare. But there's a lot of problems with C-92, and it's not to say you throw it out or keep it, just keep pushing for more changes and for more accountability. I guess what I'm trying to say is that don't expect legislation to be perfect. It's made by governments who can be fairly colonial in their mindset. They are, hopefully trying to change their ways of doing things and becoming more decolonial in their thinking, but they're not always going to get it right. And I think that's to be expected, but it's not something we're supposed to put up with. I think we should keep pushing and pushing and pushing and criticizing when there are problems with legislation, but we should anticipate them as well. And it's just sort of part of, the way things are. Also, legislation can be amended and repealed. So that's something to keep in mind. There's, unless it's a part of the Constitution, it's possible that it can be amended and repealed. However, it's a lot easier to change policy, and governments get away with changing policy. It's harder to amend legislation. So, although this is a possibility that the government could get rid of legislation, one government could get rid of legislation the previous government passed. If it's one that's giving Indigenous rights and recognizing Indigenous rights and setting something out and really positive, I think that a government would face a lot of backlash publicly for trying to pull that back. So, optics-wise, I don't know if a government would really try to do that, but it is a possibility. Okay, my last point and my last slide here is what are important features of legislation? If we're going forward on something like this, what kind of things do we want to see? So one could be national standards, about potentially the level of health that Indigenous people should be entitled to. There's provisions in the UN Declaration on this. One would also think that human rights should be protected, things like Jordan's Principle, but maybe even expanding that broader, not just to be about children, but all Indigenous people and our elders as well. National standards, I think, is one really good aspect of Bill C-92. In the past, it was different provincial legislation that applied with respect to child welfare, and some provinces had provisions that recognized the needs of Indigenous children and families, and others didn't, and all kinds of things in between. And so what Bill C-92 did was put in place standards that will apply across the country and overtake the provincial laws. They kind of apply side by side, but if the federal law is stronger than the provincial law, then the federal law will prevail, will trump the provincial law. So this could be good, because I think we see in a lot of situations of unequal treatment and different health outcomes in different provinces. So this would try to sort of standardize that across the board. So national standards about what Indigenous people are entitled to as a matter of health would be, I think, something that would be very positive. Another aspect that could potentially be included could deal with Indigenous control, more self-government over health, and perhaps the recognition that the right to health is an inherent Aboriginal right that is also confirmed in the UN Declaration. And perhaps setting out means, sort of like Bill C-92, that perhaps to actually exercise self-government over health. That's a possibility. I don't know if that's what people are discussing. But that could certainly be a possibility. And Bill C-92 provides an interesting model for this, where you don't necessarily require the government's approval to become self-governing. Indigenous group just simply has to try to enter into coordination agreements. The only problem, I will say, and it's a big problem with the coordination agreements, is that they also foresee that the provinces will engage in these negotiations, but it doesn't say who's going to pay. And that has been a big criticism of Bill C-92 from my perspective, is that it still puts us in the same hot potato situation as in the past, where the governments are going to be arguing with each other about who should be paying, and I don't think that's right. I think, the federal government should have primary jurisdiction. Perhaps there is some role from the provinces to pay for some things, but you know what? That shouldn't be First Nations people's problem. I take a Jordan's Principle approach to this. They should figure it out between themselves about who's paying for this, but really Indigenous people should not be denied services because they're arguing over who should be funding. So I think funding is quite an important aspect that should be covered. I've looked a little bit at the U.S. legislation, and this is some of the research we're going to do more into. But it looks like in the U.S. they do address quite deeply what some of the funding requirements are. So that would be something to look at. The other thing, another final point that would be important to include is accountability. And accountability can be several things. It could be reporting requirements, reporting statistics on health of Indigenous people, reporting to Parliament on this, perhaps addressing other things, but the idea being that data about Indigenous health would be out in the public and be used to inform policy development. Also, you could have things like, regular review of the legislation to make sure that, if is it doing what it should, can it be improved? That could be something as well. Another thing that it could include is also a dispute resolution mechanism. Bill C-92 doesn't specifically include one, although it contemplates that one could be developed through regulations to help resolve disputes that might come up in negotiating coordination agreements between the federal and provincial governments and Indigenous groups. I would prefer to see a dispute resolution clause built right into the legislation, not waiting for regulations to be passed at some later time, because sometimes those can take forever or they don't happen. So I think dispute resolution would be a good mechanism because it's, again, really expensive to go to court. And if there's a faster and easier way to do that, that would be great. Although I would say that we would expect that, whoever decides a dispute is at arm's length from the federal government. Often what happens, at least on some disputes like specific claims, the federal government is the arbiter of complaints against it. So it's both judge and jury. Judge, jury, and executioner, I guess, or defendant. Anyway, what I'm saying is that there needs to be some arm's length here, and it can't be the government deciding complaints against it. But again, coming back to accountability, just the fact that something is in law means that it can be used to hold the government accountable by going to court and saying the government isn't following that, which is better than just provisions, perhaps in just policies, and sometimes even in agreements. Governments don't follow their agreements, and they can, there's some rules that allow them to wiggle out of those sometimes. So those are some of the things that we might want to see in legislation. So that's basically it. Hope you found this helpful. Okay, apnabultos, apnamultoset.